Cleaning our trauma is about acknowledging what we went through, then making the choice, the decision to transform it as opposed to transfer it.
So I think it actually started with, what is this pandemic and how did it affect me? I've been cut off from my family. I've seen them like 2 or 3 times in the last 2 years. There is someone that I support through emotional, I care for them. You know, I have been a carer for them for many, many years. Their grief is the thing that broke the camel's straw for me. So it was a minor trigger point from their own trauma history in which they were preparing for day surgery, but they ended up triggering some very primal anxieties and fears. And seeing someone go through a mental health crisis across borders in a time where you're not in lockdown, but you can't do anything to help them, is what triggered my own grief.
My mother is an amazing woman. She's just so strong. I didn't always feel that way as we were growing up because we had so much movement in our life, and I always felt like she could have done better. And it wasn't until we went and seen Rabbit Proof Fence, which is an Australian film about the stolen generation and movement of Aboriginal people off their land, the children placed in institutions, that Mum had said after we had seen this film, that's what it was like for us when we were at Cootamundra Girls' Home. And I knew she was, reluctant to talk about that previously because there wasn't very much conversation.
But the thing about trauma is trauma very rarely comes from nowhere. Trauma often is the manifestation of something else. It's the culmination of a series of adverse events, experiences, or circumstances that a person becomes eventually too obvious for the person to ignore, or for the people around that person to ignore that there's something not right. The other thing is, sometimes the trauma doesn't occur in the home. The home is where the impact of the trauma is felt. And dealing with outside allows there to be some separation. It allows home to be perhaps a sanctuary, a place of safety, a place of restoration, relaxation, instead of just fertile ground for elements of the trauma to keep repeating themselves.
They were getting to a point where they had laid out their the dress that they wanted to be buried in. They were ready to take their life, and I'd heard these instances and I knew they were alarm bells, and it was just very difficult. How do I send emergency services there when I can't physically be there to support that emotional journey? And how did I know that it was time for me? That's when my mental health started suffering. So uncontrollable emotions starting to kick in, the fatigue of, I can't carry this anymore.
Well, when we go back in history and we look at the movement of Aboriginal people that were taken off land and put on reserves, which is a big part of my grandmother's story, being removed, put on land, and then there was restrictions that applied from their movement off those reserves into townships. And just one instance, when we were restricted and couldn't move around, that triggered so much for me. I thought, through those stories and that, I felt I didn't even really understand. I was just having this all this big emotion was coming up for me. And then when, I was able to sort of sit with it, breathe with it, I realised this was something that we've already experienced as Aboriginal people. And this is sort of like this separation from land because we couldn't move around.
I guess I'm not surprised that someone who has never been able to recover from forced separation from their loved ones would experience a very similar set of emotions in another situation of forced separation, even if the reasons are very different. There's a concept in psychology called the affect bridge. And basically what it looks like, or what it represents, is when we experience a set of emotions, typically adverse emotions, what our brain does is it starts to kind of connect us to every other known or remembered experience of that. And that's how that bridge is constructed rather. And oftentimes you see people, you're having some issue with them in the present, and they're clearly gone somewhere else in their mind. They're clearly dealing with some other situation that is equally unresolved. The stolen generation has never been resolved for the people who experienced it, and the impact of it we continue to see today in modern Australia.
It's when we talk about trauma, to me, it's through an experience that you have that you know that it really affects you, but you don't sort of understand it or you don't process it at the time. You're carrying something within your body that sometimes you can't account for. So that's the way I relate to trauma. And, I think this generational trauma is something that my great-great-grandmother was unable to process, to heal. And that, was passed down, I believe, to my grandmother and then to my mother and to myself, because there's triggers inside me that I, for a time, didn't understand until I started hearing their stories. And I think the acknowledgement then was able to move me through that knowing that something had to heal.
So I've been a carer for my mother, who's had mental health issues for a majority of my life. She's been suicidal several times. The first time I remember caring for her was like at the age of 6, so very young age. When was it time for me to really own that healing? The first response was to hide, right? To run away and bury it deep, deep, deep and never think about it again. So some of the signs of the COVID grieving was still a little bit of some of that trauma that had just been a past wound that I will always have with me. When post-traumatic stress hit, flashbacks of the unresolved childhood trauma that I had buried deep, 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 deep. Depression took 6 months of my life. I needed to make sure that I had a voice there, because for so many years my own voice was buried.
Yeah, and I really love the way that you framed cleaning trauma, because I never heard that term before. It's like healing, cleaning, and I really sort of thought really deeply about that word, because when we can clean something, and it's very superficial, but to do the deep clean, you have to do the work.
Cleaning our trauma to me means revisiting the complex spider web of life, right? A lot of my trauma roots actually come from intergenerational trauma.
Cleaning our trauma to me means that we actually first have to know what the mess is, right? And I actually have an analogy that I use with clients. I say, people who walk through my door, they come in because it's like they had a party and they need some help to clean up the kitchen, and they're aware of that. And I say, so while you're here, yes, I can help you clean up the kitchen, but maybe we should have a look around and see what else is going on in the rest of the house. And even better, we could just spring clean the whole thing. Now, why? Because actually, if we do that, we get an opportunity to resolve a lot of the issues that we didn't even realise were there. We talk about your skeletons in the closet, the stuff that we have so not looked at for such a long time that we don't even realise the impact that it's having.
When I was grieving with a trauma most recently with COVID, all that it took was a reminder to say, hey, stop trying to run from the pain and just sit with it. So I prepared just the initial steps. I had to make sure that I was prioritizing my own well-being and prioritizing my own self-care and cutting myself off from all those triggers as well, which was more about, pushing boundaries in place. And as much as there were some other people grieving, it's like, take your own space, take what you can.
The ignoring it, I say to people, it ends up like nuclear waste inside, and you've got this, it's just leaching its way into your whole system. So by ignoring it, we're actually potentially causing other problems. And so that's a big part of where I see my mission in life, is actually about trying to educate people about the fact that we can resolve it, but we've got to stop teaching our children to pretend it didn't happen.
This can happen over a long, long period of time. I think it's the same as grief. You can't put a time on grief, and you can't put time on healing from some of these really deep, hurtful experiences that I say myself I have had, but also my mum and my grandmother and grandmother. So I've got to, do the work. Just do the work, because I'm still committed to not passing anything on to my children. And we have many conversations. And one of my daughters, she talks about generational trauma. She's a counsellor, and she's done a lot of study around psychology. And so we have these conversations, and I just love that she's been in that space, because she understands how much cleaning I've had to do. And, when I sit with the young girls and, we yarn up about certain things, it's like, their past experience has brought them where they are now. And it's sort of understanding the past that will make up who you are in the present. But you now make that decision and define who you are going to be in the future.
And in these deep moments of despair, we feel like we're the only ones going through it. And we feel like I can't possibly tell anyone else, or I don't want to burden anyone else. But that is the one thing that is taking away the power that the human spirit can bring. If we are bold enough to share courage in our voice and voice what is actually going on, then others can step up to the plate to help support you. So that's my message.